All right. Thank you so much for joining another episode of Celeste the Therapist podcast. My name is Celeste. I am a therapist from Boston, Massachusetts. And I have a really special guest. I'm going to have him introduce himself to you all.
Hello, everyone, from Boston, Massachusetts to Montreal, Canada, and everywhere else where this is being broadcasted. My name is David Archer. I'm an anti racist psychotherapist. I'm a trauma therapist, supervisor, approved consultant for EMDR. And my job is really just to help people to just recognize their awesomeness and just to help therapists to get to that next level. And I'm hoping that we can have a nice discussion and yeah, we'll see where it takes us.
Of
That's
course,
pretty much it.
David, of course, we're going to have a nice discussion. You're an anti racist therapist, and I'm all about decolonizing what mental health looks like, which is why I started this podcast. So, this is actually going to be broken up into two conversations. David is somebody who is well versed in information, and I love how he explains things. And I just love his message that he's trying to do to help others. So, before I kind of start with like going into your book, the first book, which is called Anti Racist Psychotherapy Confronting Systemic Racism and Healing Racial Trauma,
Hmm.
which he has right there for people listening on the audio. You can check it out on YouTube. So I kind of want to start with talking about this because this is important for me. But first, I'm curious about, did you always know you were going to be a therapist growing up?
Oh, this is a great therapist question. Oh, okay. So now I got to go way back.
What do you
So,
want me to do? We got to know. People, listen, David. People think like, oh, well, it's easy for you to do that because you're a therapist. I'm like, listen, listen, listen. I did
hmm
not think I was going to be nobody's therapist.
hmm
So I just need the people to know we're not born as therapists.
No, no, we are not. And it's like, but someone also asked me a question too, is like, how did I become like anti-racist as a psychotherapist and all of that? So Montreal and Canada, if anyone knows about like the history of Quebec, the history of Canada is also kind of similar, like the history of your country, if you're listening to this from the United States or from other any other country that colonization played a key role in the construction of the country. It's like when I was young, so I was raised around the time where there was a referendum that was taking place in my province where Quebec wanted to separate from the rest of Canada because Quebec has a different cultural history. Quebecers tend to see themselves, they may not always say it, but they kind of see themselves like a separate ethnic group than the rest of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Canadians that are also in Canada. So I was faced with this idea because again, my parents are from Jamaica. So we were Jamaican. So and I always knew I was Jamaican. I always knew I was black. But when they decided that they were going to separate, then I also came to understand that I was an Anglophone versus being a Francophone, that I was an English speaker rather than a French speaker. And then there were some years where there was the Oka crisis. So this is a point where there were people who were trying to take more land away from people who were in the native communities. So not only was it that they forced a lot of native people from their original like lands where they lived and took a lot of land from them, but in the 90s they were also trying to take more land from them. So it was a context of me knowing that there's like English versus French versus white versus native versus black versus, you know what I mean? So I was always aware of the importance of identity. I was always aware of the idea that there are people who are suffering and they may be suffering based on their identity that other people see them as. And for me, as a young person, I just know that I was always fascinated with is there a way that I'd be able to speak to anybody and to learn how to speak to anybody and talk to anybody from wide varieties of different backgrounds and all that? So before I was a therapist, I was a computer programmer, and I was thinking that I was very interested in how we would be able to code complex software by using very simple instructions to a computer. And then I was thinking, well, let me try therapy. Maybe there's an easy way to deal with the complexities of the mind, and that's the biggest mistake of my life. No, humans and our minds we're so complex that there's no simple way of being able to help a person. But if we can get to understand the language of how they express themselves, if we can sit and try to understand from different perspectives how their spirit manifests, how their dreams manifest, how they overcome their obstacles, then there's a way of being able to reverse engineer the suffering that has caused the person to locate themselves in this present moment. And so as I became trained as a therapist, I noticed that talking was not enough. As I became trained as a therapist, I noticed that our field itself was very white and built on the structures of white supremacy and the idea uh, of different races being lesser than and different races being greater than. And as I started to work with some of these same Native people, I started to get in touch with the understanding that some of their suffering was not only based on their individual experience, but also on this multi-generational transmission of trauma, but also on Canada creating the Indian Act, the politics behind the suffering of the Native person, and all of the knowledge that I learned from there, all of the knowledge I learned from all the different races, the different cultures that I met with, brought me to this point where I wanted to try to find a way of just focusing on solving the problem of racism. So while it is complex, I think it's just like any other line of computer code, is that it takes a little bit of debugging, takes a little bit of patience, a little bit of creativity, and there's ways how we can solve even these great problems of our time.
Thank you for sharing that. You know, my awakening didn't happen until college, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Trayvon Martin case.
Hmm.
Seeing how society reacted to that was eye opening for me. I think just kind of living in a system where things didn't always work out was more of the norm. And as I became older, I took Afrikaan studies and just
Nice.
got into the field. I started to understand, you know, we didn't start off as slaves, but
Hmm.
in our history in America, like in our schooling, that's where we start. So, you know, if I'm not a slave anymore, I feel like I've kind of made it, right? Not recognizing that my ancestors were more than slaves. Um,
Mm-hmm.
how would you define racism? Because I heard you on another show talk about it kind of being a social, the way society set it up to profit and benefit. How would you define it for my audience?
Yeah, well, I'd define racism as a system that has a function. Is that I don't believe in an accidental racism. Just like as you're saying, Celeste, is that and even though we have a different country, our countries still operate based off of this idea of imperialism and the idea of some country being at the top and the other ones being at the bottom. It's the reason why some of our countries hoard vaccines and other countries don't have the ability to to vaccinate their population because there's a me first mentality. So in a similar way, when I was taking my history classes, it was just as if the colonizers arrived and then they became friends with the native people, and for some reason, the number of natives just decreased. The colonizers arrived, and for some reason, black people were there magically. And black people, the beginning of black people was our enslavement. And as I started to read more, as I started to study more, I realized that it just didn't add up. That the pieces didn't add up for me. And racism, in a way, was a justification to be able to enslave and to colonize and to destroy and enact genocide upon others without an expression of moral guilt. So, if you're able to say that a person is less than a man, then when you harm them, are you really causing the same amount of harm that it would be as if you harmed your brother or your sister? If it's just an animal, then is it really any different from what it says in the Bible about Adam needing to be able to name these creatures? So the thing is that the man is not necessarily seen at the same level as the beast, and the man is not seen at the same level as even the earth. And so, if we are able to say instead that the black man is not really a man, he doesn't really, he doesn't really feel pain as much. So, pregnant black women, they don't, and like black women in general, they don't need as much pain medication as white women. You know, black man being shot. If we're talking about even George Floyd, if we're talking about many of the other violent actions that have taken place against black people, it's not really the same. And the reason why they say these terrible things and they enact this is so that there's not as much of a pushback that takes place. So when Black Lives Matter comes out, and when people are saying, well, Black life matters, then the response is, well, no, all lives matter. I do agree that all life does matter. But the reason why we bring this up is because we see that there's this disproportionate amount of Black people that are incarcerated, this disproportionate amount of Black people who are faced, where to the point where race is associated with poverty. We can see that it's not accidental if it's systemic. If it's taking place in the fact that you and I, Celeste, are some of the only Black therapists that your listeners have probably ever heard of or seen, then that can't all be by accident. And so I do believe that in my book, I explain it through speaking, conducting, or like from referring to the research of others. But racism is designed to ensure the absolute victory and to prevent any form of suffering um, for white people. So the first victims of racism is white people. It's not black people. Is that white people themselves were going through an intense amount of suffering and pain, which is the reason why there's this fight or flight energy from of them leaving Europe to come to here, and then enacting that fight or flight energy in order to construct these countries, these nation states that are not necessarily nations in the typical sense, but we create this idea of a nation with these continued fictions of who is better than and who is lesser than. So again, if you ask me a question, I'm going to give a 10-minute answer. I do hope that answered your question, but I like to talk around the problem so that we can get to the solution.
No, it was helpful. And I think understanding the history, right, when it comes to now and how we see ourselves, can you share with people how the way society set up the system in order for us, a certain population to thrive, and you're in that system, how much that plays a role in how you see yourself and your value?
Hmm.
I don't know if
Hmm.
people realize, like, it's not that we grew up and our parents said, hey, like, you're not good enough or you can't do this, but we have to understand where we live and the way it was designed, not for our benefit. And I love the fact that you said the fact that there's not a lot of Black therapists, it's not by accident, that's on purpose. But can you share with people how much that plays a role in, like, your environment with the way you see yourself and your value?
Sure. Yeah. So in the book, I speak about the idea of the binary complex trauma cycle. So that there's this side that relates to just a construct called white supremacy. And then there's another side that relates to a construct that's called Black suffering. And so what happens is that in order to maintain the idea of whiteness being this unblemished, this unaltered, perfect state of an individual, then all of the trauma relating to whiteness, all of the multi-generational, like if we speak about Europe and the Black Death, the pandemics that plagued them, the witch hunts that took place, the amount of fear and destruction that took place based on gender, based on class and kings and queens and all of that violence. In order, what we need to do is separate that, and instead we project negative qualities into the black body. So then that means that even though black people, some of our ancestors were worked until they were killed or until they died, we would say black people are lazy. Even though that there was a lot of, and we usually don't talk about this when we speak about enslaved people and our enslaved ancestors, but there's a lot of sexual violence towards black women by the white enslaver. So we will, even though there was a lot of violence in that way, because with capitalism, the easiest way to be able to increase your workforce is just to generate new ones. So that's the reason why these white enslavers would sexually assault our ancestors. We would say then that it's the black woman then, or the black man that is hypersexualized, despite the fact this comes from the white violence, the people who have the power. So all of these negative forms of projections enact this idea called soul murder, which I explain more in my book. And when the black person then is internalizing this false narrative of who they are, of thinking that our hair is the worst, our music is the worst, all of this doesn't come from us. This comes from the media that we consume that's going to maintain this fake idea. But when we internalize it, then it validates the idea of whiteness being this perfect idea. So when we are talking about racism that is affecting Black people, we have an incomplete story unless we talk about the fact that the negative impact it has on Black people benefits white people. This is because I'm also trained as a couple and family therapist. So the idea of looking at things as systems is much more helpful for us than just looking at the victim in isolation. We have to also consider what is the motivation of the victimizer for us to fully understand how the violence itself manifests and why it perpetuates in the first place. So I think that although you're seeing a lot of strange performative things in 2022 and you've seen them in 2021, every business is like, what? We need more diversity, equity, and inclusion. We need to have more pictures from Shutterstock with Black people in them in our advertisements because that's going to show that we care about Black people. Um, the thing is, it's a little bit more complex than that. What we actually need to do, if we want to be truly anti racist instead of performative, is we need to give Black people power. But if you give Black people power, and if you make it so that instead of being like, yeah, let's make more Black janitors in our business, this will make it so that we're equitable. If we say, yo, we need more Black CEOs, you're going to see people be like, wait, hold on. We're not that anti racist. No, you're pushing it a little bit. We don't got to do all that. And that's because that will be an equalizer. If we're able to make it so that Blackness is no longer associated with poverty, that Blackness itself is no longer associated with suffering, with vice, and with all the other negative projections that come from what white people themselves deal with and struggle with, then we will start to see things start to balance. But that is challenging because that means shaking the system. And there's no system that really likes to be shaken. So that's why you're going to see just more photo ops for 2022 because it's more convenient. You don't have to shake the system. And then you can maintain this idea of white supremacy versus Black suffering.
So interesting. Jane, what is her last name?
Jane
It's white.
Elliott,
Jane Elliott said
she's,
that
yes. Yeah, go
she's
ahead.
amazing. She said that she's like, if you're white and you grew up in America, 'cause she was talking, then
Hmm.
you're more than likely racist, not because you said like, hey, I want to be a racist, but and she said if you pass social studies, because
Mm.
everywhere you go, like there's this power dynamic and what you talked about. I even had a white pastor, David Swanson, on here, and he talked about the same thing. He described he lives in Chicago, and he heard someone was stepping on the wet concrete that he did, and in his mind he said it must have been like he thought it was like a black kid from the school, and he looked outside and he said I just paused because I was like it was a white kid from the
Yeah.
prep school, and he said to himself, what, why did I think that, like why
Yeah.
was the first image, and he had to confront what was going on and became more intentional about the way, but in order, my point I guess is like in order to do that you have to admit what's happening, that self-aware, and
Real.
that's hard. Who wants to give up power? Who wants to change a system that's benefiting
Mm.
them? Of course, like that's why there's this struggle in certain parts of my country in America. They're trying to get rid of learning about the different things that's happened,
Oh, yes.
because we want to make everything seem like it's fine when it's really
Yeah.
not fine.
Yeah, and so since you also work in mental health, we have clients that have all types of defense mechanisms that may that from their past may be very difficult or challenging. So they find ways of dissociating from their past, or they may find ways of just like conveniently forgetting and conveniently omitting certain types of information. Because again, it's like if we do consider our whole history, that takes courage. I think some of the most bravest people in the world are the people who seek help. The person who's going to go and sit with a therapist and be like, yo, this is what happened when I was young. Yo, this is what happened when I was a teenager. Yo, this is what happened throughout my whole adulthood and all of that. That takes courage. This is not regular people who are able to seek help. The easiest thing we can do is instead just forget about the past. And the interesting thing about racism, the trauma of racism, I think, for a lot of white people, is that they had to blur out a lot of their past. The trauma of racism for Black people is the same thing. For it to survive and for us to internalize the negative ideas, we have to believe that our existence began when white people became involved. So we need to start with slavery if racism is to be successful. But if we're to really know that, like 10,000 years ago, that there were Nubian, Kemetic, also known as Egyptian, civilizations, that some of the people who created math and like arithmetic and like even some of the people who were developing the first structures, that these were some dark skinned individuals, then it turns the idea of racism on its head. Then it looks like a story that's been interrupted, is that there was a period where we were at a level where there was power, and then slavery came and interrupted that. That makes more sense to me. That also, there's something that makes a little bit more sense, because those pyramids are not that's not built from IKEA. Okay, those pyramids are here for a long time. Okay, so the thing is, how old are some of these things? Even the Sphinx, I think they said, is more than 10,000 years old. Yo, Canada's been around not even like what, 200 years. The States has been around like not even like 400, 500 maybe. Are even the language we're using this in English? This thing hasn't been around that long. English as a language is kind of young, but there's civilizations from dark-skinned people that predate Egyptian dynasties. So that's what I mean, is that if we just start with only the part where, like, there's some books that will be like trying to explain about racism and will only start with slavery, then it's not even half the story.
So
And
true.
yeah, yeah, please go ahead.
And I was gonna say that knowing this fact, right? Like knowing the fact that there's a story behind what's happening. The same way, like I'm glad you brought up mental health. When people come to me, they'll come with this issue that's happening in the now, and
Yes.
I learn their story and I help them make connections, because sometimes they feel like, "What's wrong with me? Why am I like this?" And then it's like, "Well, you had to dissociate because blah blah blah," whatever the case
Mhm.
is. And I think being able to understand that helps. And speaking of that, when I think about something you said on I wish I remember his name, the
That's okay.
uh, another podcast in the UK, I think. But you
Dave
said,
Palma, maybe.
yes, you said we talk about psychotherapy or psychotherapy with Black people as if we're the victims and there's no perpetrator. Can you explain that? Because I really want people to understand the importance of um, knowing that a system may be part of the suffering, and it's not as clear cut as like, here, take this pill. Not that
Mhm,
I'm not
mhm.
saying anything is wrong. I'm not knocking pills, but I think a lot of times our people come in and get support and
Yeah.
don't really
Yeah.
get heard.
Yeah, and I agree, and because there's some clients, there are some people where their suffering is that intense that they do need medication, and the best way of being able to help them is with medication and psychotherapy. I do think that there's some people that there might be a little bit of shame about taking a medication, but just to know that it's a step in the right direction, because I want all people to know that there's things that have happened to people that make it so that they act or behave in these specific ways. So I'll talk a little bit about PTSD for a second. So typically when I'm meeting with a new client, I like to have a phone call with them so I can explain what it is that I do. So the approach that I use is called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, EMDR. And this is a form of therapy that is highly effective for people who are suffering from PTSD, complex PTSD, depression. It has a lot of research and all that behind it.
And
But
I've been a client. I've done it for my listeners. It's really good, EMDR.
awesome.
Yeah, go ahead.
Y'all are hearing it from Celeste, all right? You guys are hearing it, so it's actually pretty nice. Okay, so it's not easy though. It's not easy, but it gets the job done. So when my clients are asking me about, well, what is this EMDR thing, then I have to explain to them about PTSD and the short story of PTSD. This is the stereotypical idea: is that there's a soldier and he goes off to war. While he's on the battlefield, he sees and hears a lot of terrible things. When he comes back, he may have certain behaviors, maybe certain actions, certain ways how he's experiencing the world that seem for us who are at home as if it's like unconventional or doesn't make sense. Why is it that he's being hyper vigilant? Why is it that he is reacting to these loud sounds? Why is it that he is stockpiling weapons, etc., etc.? But all of those behaviors make a lot of sense if you're on the battlefield. So a lot of times it's they're the response that a person is going to have makes more sense if they were back in the situation where the initial trauma took place. So if we only look at the person in their present context without understanding where they came from or what happened to them, then we are missing the point. When we are talking about the trauma of racism, so it's a similar thing as that if I'm going to have a client who comes in and they talk about that they themselves have been through this racist experience at work, it's possible for a white therapist or for a therapist who's black, who's just like completely out of touch with the idea. If they only look at that individual based on the context, they can say that, you know, it might be just a cognitive distortion that you have. Maybe it's not that all people are bad against you. If they're not looking at the full history of what it means to be a black man in America, what it means to be a black person in North America, et cetera, et cetera. So that's like at the level of society. So that's kind of zooming out and looking at the level of society. But we also, in some cases, have to zoom out and look at the level of time, saying that it's not only what's happened to the client when they're telling me this right now, we also have to think, well, what happened when they were much younger? But the difference with the strategy and the approach that I'm using in anti racist psychotherapy is that I also look at racism as being something that affects something much deeper than just the central executive functioning or the frontal lobe. This is affecting the limbic system. When a person is hit with racism, they are having survival based responses. This individual you spoke about who said, I don't know why I was thinking that it was a black child, it was actually this white person. It's because racism itself is not logical, it's psychological, and it's based on this limbic system response of fight, flight, or freeze. When I talk about the trauma of racism and why it's so hard to not be racist, it's because that initial injury that took place is associated with all this other imagery that is on your social media, all this other imagery that's in your Hollywood and your movies and all of that stuff that is reactivating this adrenaline like behavior, this cortisol release type of behavior, this fight, flight, or freeze action. So when a person is busy saying, I don't want to be racist, their nervous system is reacting as if they're going to die unless they get rid of that black person or that black person's doing all of this stuff. So for us to really target racism, we have to treat it as if it is that PTSD. We have to look at our nations and our countries and start to think, how deep are these wounds? And if we could advance the technology of the psychotherapy that we're using, then we may be able to move towards reprocessing that complex PTSD that is in our nations, that is in our populations, and making it so that that soldier can actually return home and feel safe in his or her body. That we can reprocess this original trauma, that there doesn't have to be these negative beliefs about white supremacy, this, black suffering, that. And once we can reprocess, desensitize the intensity of that pain, then we can start to install the positive beliefs that have been there all along to sustain us. These ones that say we're all one people, these ones that say that we're all family, that we're all cousins. This one that says that we're not all safe until we're all safe. We're not safe until everyone is like out of this. When we get back to this collectivist idea, this personalist idea that everyone is special on the basis of who they are, not because they need to fight to get a certain amount of likes or subscriptions. That a person is beautiful, that a person is worthwhile because they're alive, that their ancestors fought for them to be here, that even our ancestors fought, that they survived unimaginable difficulties for each and every one of these your listeners right now to even hear this. Um, it's for us to know that our lives are worthwhile. That can only come when we are able to feel safe and secure in our bodies, when we no longer have to play this game of white and black, this madness of what class, what caste. No, we need to. I think we need to level up our society, and it's possible. It just takes a little bit of complexity, takes a different type of operating system, takes a different type of programming language, and I do think that if people do consciously put our minds, our good minds together, and we are able to make it out of this and move
Your
on to the next
your
level.
your computer background is coming out.
Yeah,
I
for
can
real.
see you have the problem is there, and it's just like different lines. There's so many different things that need to
You got it.
happen.
You got it. And the thing is, I think this conversation is one of them. I think there are some people that
Absolutely.
some people who might, just like as you were saying before, is that if you were able to learn and if you were able to become a therapist, there's also people who are able to learn and they're able to become healers in different ways. But this is
Mhm,
just the
mhm.
beginning of the solution. And
Yeah, it is.
yeah.
And for people that are listening and are feeling it's inspired by this idea of confronting systemic racism, it sounds like what you're saying, part of it is educating yourself about your history can be helpful. Knowing where you came from originally, I think is a huge start. And trying to, like, I had a therapist talk about when people experience trauma, they're divorced from their bodies, and
Mm,
trying to like really get back into your body and paying attention to your body's response to things as it comes up, so
yes.
it can become safe again. I I never, in EMDR, was, I was in therapy, but then I had a went to EMDR person for 8 weeks, and I can't remember everything, but I remember like feeling more complete after after those
Mm,
sessions. Um, and I think it's a powerful thing to feel like you can be in your body. And at 39, at 20, I didn't know peace was available to me. And I think one of the messages you and I want to tell people that look like us is that peace is available to you despite your experiences, whether it's
mm-hmm.
within your home or within your like the system. Because we talk about systems, but also in our homes, there has been trauma that
Yes.
is complex, and I don't want people to allow their story or what has happened to be the narrative of where they're going or how far they can go. Um,
Mm.
does that make sense? What I'm saying?
100, 100. It's because I meet people who believe that they're broken. And when a
Yes.
person is going to say that they're broken, in fact, anytime that we are describing ourselves, we're describing the past because the moment has passed already. So if a person is going to say that they are broken, then I'll say, well, are you ready to change that? And when a person is able to decide how they want to live their lives and is able and willing to rewrite this narrative, that they have the courage to sit and confront the suffering, then something changes about that narrative. Because now, not only is it that they were a person who was considering themselves as broken, whether it's 2 seconds ago or 10 seconds ago, now they're able to have open up the possibility that there's maybe a little bit of glue that they could put with the different pieces, maybe a little bit of tape, a little bit of duct tape, that we're repairing it. And if a person is able to rewrite this narrative of what other people have given to them, then they're able to take back that power and they can open up the possibility of who they're meant to be. And it's a beautiful thing. I've seen it. I've seen too many people heal and recover for me to believe anyone ever again telling me that they're broken. I've seen too
Yeah.
many beautiful things in this world. And so
Yes.
I may not have like I'm still at the beginning of my journey of life, but I've seen so many beautiful things for me to give up on people. I think that everyone is deserving of the
Absolutely.
gift of recovery.
Absolutely. And this is like episode 342, I think. And throughout different episodes I share pieces of my story, and I know I'm passionate the way I am about mental health and talking about it is because I've from a place of healing, and
Hmm.
I recognize that it's available for all of us, but I also recognize access is a struggle. So I'm always about decolonizing what mental health looks like and not making
Real.
it very commercialized. So I appreciate like the work that you do and the message that you're trying to give to the people because it's so needed.
Thank you. Thank you. And I also, just on that part of decolonizing, of just knowing that healing can come from the therapist. But I have a belief that the best psychotherapist in the world is somebody's grandmother who makes the wickedest chicken noodle soup. And it's like, for some reason, you drink the soup and it like recovers, like, it just like changes all your assessment scores on the PCL-5 and the anxiety assessments and all of that. And I say that just for people to know that there are multiple ways of healing. And healing is not
Yes.
only, it's kind of like, this is my belief, is that God is not only in the church, God
Mhm.
is not only in the building, and also that divinity exists within all individuals. This
Yes.
ability to heal is not only at the therapist, the therapist is only there to awaken the healing that is within you.
Yes, that's so good. And it's kind of dope coming from therapists because it's not like we're like, oh, forget those therapists. We
Hmm.
actually get paid for being therapists, and we're
Hmm.
talking about like it's not the only way.
For real.
And yeah, so that's good coming from us.
For real.
So on the next episode, we're gonna talk about healing with Black meditation.
Yes.
David originally reached out to me about Black meditation, and I started looking into him, and I'm like, I gotta start with this before we talk about Black. I gotta give it its own episode. So, we'll be back next week. But if you're listening to this during the week, that is already out, then you're good. But if not, you gotta wait. And we'll be back.
All right. Many blessings, everyone. You take good care.